The town of Grover's Mill, Montana, sits at the edge of a valley that the interstate forgot. One main road and one main road out, and everything worth knowing about a person visible by the time they've walked half a block. The mountains to the west turn purple in October, and the cold comes early, and the people who stay through winter are the kind of people who mean to stay forever. Starling's Diner has been on the corner of 4th and Clement for 31 years. The sign out front lost its apostrophe sometime in 2009, and Owen Sattler never got around to fixing it. The booths are red vinyl patched in 3 places with electrical tape that no longer matches. The coffee is strong and hot and served without asking. The pie is made from scratch every morning by a woman named Patsy, who comes in at 4 a.m. and leaves before the lunch crowd and has never once been late in 11 years. It is the kind of place that knows who you are before you sit down. On the second Wednesday of October at 2:30 in the afternoon, Cord Malone sat alone in the corner booth by the window. He was a big man, not tall but built the way certain men are built when decades of physical work have compressed everything unnecessary and left only what remains. 72 years old, head shaved clean, a gray beard that reached nearly to his collarbone, thick and deliberate, the beard of a man who made a decision about it long ago and never revisited the question. His hands rested on the table around a mug of black coffee, wide hands scarred across the knuckles, in the particular way that comes not from fighting, but from engines, from metal, from a life spent fixing things. The vest he wore was leather, and it was old in a way that fashion cannot manufacture. It had been washed by rain across 3 states. It had been folded and unfolded in the saddlebags of a 1971 Harley-Davidson for going on 30 years. The patches on it were faded at the edges, some cracked along the lettering, and a man who knew what he was looking at would have gone very quiet looking at them. Each one was a chapter. Each one had weight. Cord had a folded newspaper beside the coffee mug, and his eyes rested somewhere near the window. Not reading, not watching. Just present the way a man is present when he has learned over many decades that most of what happens in a room does not require his involvement. He was not bothering anyone. He never did. Nora Finch had worked the afternoon shift at Starling's for 11 years. She knew every regular by their order, knew which booths the light hit wrong in the afternoon, knew which topics Owen Sattler would and would not discuss before his second cup of coffee. She had seen Cord Malone come in on Wednesday afternoons for as long as she had worked there, and she had learned the way you learn things about people you pay attention to. That he took his coffee black and his silence seriously, and that he tipped 20%, regardless of the bill. When the bell above the door jangled at 2:33, Nora looked up from the counter the way she always did. She saw who it was. Her jaw tightened. Fletcher Grady entered first. He was 57 years old and wore it the way men wear it when money has insulated them from most of the things that age other people. Business casual that cost more than Nora made in 2 weeks. The tan of a man who golfs in places with names on them. His posture was the posture of someone for whom every room he entered had always been a room built to receive him, and he had never once had reason to doubt it. Behind him came Sylvia Grady, oversized sunglasses worn indoors, a silk blouse the color of cream. The particular stillness of a woman who treats her own presence as a performance and who has learned to read rooms the way a predator reads terrain, scanning, assessing, selecting. The Gradys had property 20 miles outside Grover's Mill. They had been passing through town for going on 3 years, and in 3 years they had left behind them a residue that a place like Grover's Mill does not forget. There was the matter of the teenage cashier at the hardware store publicly humiliated over a pricing error that turned out to be the store's mistake, not hers. There was the lawsuit threat against a 63-year-old farmer over a fence line 2 inches off a lawsuit threatened on a Friday afternoon with full knowledge that the farmer could not afford a lawyer by Monday. There was Ruth Elmore, a widow of 71, who had made the mistake of parking in a spot the Gradys felt was theirs, and what happened after was the kind of thing people in Grover's Mill still talked about in lowered voices. Scene after scene, town after town, the Gradys moved through the world with the serene confidence of people who had learned that consequences were for other people. The diner went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something shifts in the air before anyone can name what it is. Sylvia Grady scanned the room. She had a method. Her eyes moved from booth to booth the way a person moves through a buffet assessing value, calculating yield. She passed over the regulars, the retired men at the counter, the young mother in the far booth with a toddler. And then her eyes landed on Cord Malone. Something lit up in her face. Fletcher saw it. He always did. It was the private language of two people who had been doing this together for a long time. They moved past three empty booths, slid into the one directly beside Cord Malone with the unhurried ease of people performing a familiar routine. Sylvia settled in and removed her sunglasses slowly, deliberately, the way a person removes them when they want to be seen doing it. Owen Sattler came out from the back with a dish towel over one shoulder. He looked at the Gradys, he looked at Cord, he looked at Nora with an expression that carried everything that could not be said in a room with paying customers. It began quietly. It always did. A comment to Fletcher about the smell old grease and something else Sylvia said, wrinkling her nose. Then the vinyl on the seats. Then louder now about the type of establishment one finds in towns like this and the type of people one encounters in them. Fletcher smiled. It was the smile of a man for whom cruelty directed at someone else is a form of relaxation. Cord did not look up from his coffee. Nora had stopped moving. She was standing at the counter holding a coffee pot she had forgotten about watching. Sylvia's voice rose a register. She said something about the vest. Old leather and old pretensions, she said to Fletcher, as though Cord were a piece of furniture that happened to be in the room. She said something about Halloween coming early. A few people near the door quietly gathered their things. Fletcher leaned forward, elbows on the table, the posture of a man settling in for something enjoyable. He looked at the side of Cord's head and said that some men peak early and spend the rest of their lives wearing the evidence of it. Sylvia laughed. It was a practiced laugh, the kind designed to carry. Cord reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, set it down. His face did not change. This was the thing about Cord Malone that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for weakness. The stillness. The absolute unhurried, untroubled stillness. It looked to the uninitiated like a man who did not know what was happening to him or did not care or had no recourse. It looked like an easy target going easier. It was none of those things. Olvie Tharp sat at the far end of the counter, 75 years old and built like a man who had been large once and was now working through the diminishment of age with something between dignity and stubbornness. He walked with a cane. He wore a VFW cap every day of his life. He had known Cord Malone for 28 years, and he was watching the Gradys the way you watch a person who has stepped onto ice they cannot see through. He did not move. Not yet. Fletcher Grady decided he needed to make a point. The mechanism of it was simple. He picked up the glass of red wine that Nora had brought without enthusiasm, stood up, stepped the 2 feet between booths, and poured the entire glass over the top of Cord Malone's head. The wine ran down the clean dome of his skull, down through the gray beard, into the collar of the old leather vest, soaking the patches, the ones with weight, the ones that told chapters of a life. It dripped from the edge of the table and hit the linoleum in a slow, steady rhythm. The sound it made was the only sound in the room. A woman near the window put her hand over her mouth. Nora gripped the counter edge with both hands. Owen Sattler went absolutely still in the way a man goes still when he is deciding something. Fletcher set the empty glass down on the edge of Cord's table with a small, satisfied click. The click of a man who has just confirmed something he believed about the world, that there are people who matter and people who do not, and that he had the power to demonstrate the difference whenever he chose. He remained standing, waiting for the response. The shout, the shove, the scramble that would make him feel what he needed to feel. Cord Malone did not move for a long time. The room held its breath with him. Then slowly enough that you could feel it, the deliberateness of it, the absolute refusal to be rushed. He reached up and took a paper napkin from the dispenser on the table. He wiped his face, the wine on his beard, on his jaw, along the side of his neck. He wiped carefully, thoroughly, the way a man tends to something that belongs to him and deserves care. He folded the napkin, placed it on the table beside the coffee mug. Then he stood up. He was not tall, but when Cord Malone stood up in a room, something happened to the dimensions of it. Not threat, exactly. Presence. The kind that comes from a man who has been in rooms where the stakes were real, who has carried real weight over a long time, and who has arrived at a place in his life where he does not need to announce himself. He turned and looked at Fletcher Grady, not with anger, not with the hot flash of wounded pride or the cold calculation of a man planning consequences. He looked at Fletcher the way you look at something you have been told about for a long time and have finally with your own eyes confirmed. And then Cord Malone spoke. 7 words, Voice low and hurried, flat in the way that true calm is flat. Not the flatness of suppression, but the flatness of a man who has already moved through surprise and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. I was hoping the stories weren't true. He did not say it to Fletcher. Not exactly. He said it the way a man says something to himself that has finally been settled. An accounting, a verdict that has been pending for 7 months and has now been entered into the record. Fletcher blinked. Sylvia's smile did not disappear. It faltered. The difference between those two things is everything. A disappearing smile is a reaction. A faltering smile is a crack in something structural. They had prepared in the practiced way that people like the Gradys prepare for the standard responses. Rage, shouting, the trembling hands of an old man who knows he cannot do anything but wants to feel like he tried. Perhaps the fumbled reach for a phone, a threat about lawyers, a voice pitched too high. These were the responses they were accustomed to. These were the responses that fed something in them. They had not prepared for this. For the 7 words delivered in a voice that was quieter and steadier, and more unsettling than anything loud could have been, because the words were not aimed at them. They were aimed inward at something Cord Malone had been carrying, and they were the sound of that thing being put down. Cord reached into the front pocket of his vest, took out his phone, looked at it for a moment, typed a message. Short. 11 words, though no one in the room could see that. He sent it, put the phone away and sat back down. Picked up his coffee. The wine was still drying in his beard. He did not wipe it again. He opened the newspaper. The room did not know what to do with this. Fletcher Grady remained standing beside the booth for a moment that stretched past comfort. The glass was on the table. The wine was on the old man. The old man was reading the newspaper. Fletcher looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at Fletcher. Something passed between them that was new. Not the familiar current of shared cruelty, but something closer to the beginning of unease. Fletcher sat back down. He said something to Sylvia, a recalibration disguised as a continuation, the kind of thing people say when they need to reassert the narrative of what just happened, because the room's reading of it has not gone the way they required. Sylvia nodded. She picked up the menu, though she had no intention of ordering anything that required an effort to eat. And then Olvie Tharp at the far end of the counter shifted on his stool. He did not stand up yet. He was thinking about whether to. He had known for 11 months that the Gradys had been working their way through this part of Montana, the way weather works through a valley, not malicious in the way that implies planning, but destructive in the way that implies indifference, which is sometimes worse. He had known for 7 months what Cord Malone had been doing about it. He had been one of the 3 people in Grover's Mill who knew, and he had kept it the way old men keep the things given to them, in trust without decoration, without disclosure, and without question. He looked at Cord's left wrist where the sleeve of the vest had ridden up when Cord wiped his face. The tattoo was there. It was always there. A name in plain block letters worn slightly soft at the edges by decades. 4 letters. A name that Olvie Tharp had known for 50 years. A name that meant something specific and irreplaceable to both of them, and to no one else in this room except Owen Sattler, who had also seen it, and Nora Finch, who had not known what she was seeing until she looked at Olvie's face and understood that it mattered. Olvie closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and he looked at the Gradys, and what was in his eyes then was not anger either. It was something older than anger. Something that had been there a long time, waiting for the right moment to be used. He was still deciding when Nora Finch finally set down the coffee pot. Outside on 4th Street, a pickup truck moved slowly past the window. The October sky above the mountains was the particular shade of gray that comes before the cold settles in for good. Not threatening, just inevitable, the sky of a place that has been through enough winters to stop being surprised by them. Inside Starling's diner, the wine dripped from the table edge, one slow drop at a time, and Cord Malone turned the page of his newspaper, and the room waited without knowing it was waiting. And the day moved forward the way days move when something has already been set in motion that no one can see yet, except the man who said it. Fletcher Grady leaned across the table and said something low to Sylvia. She laughed again, but this time the laugh did not carry. And across the room so quietly that no one heard it. Olvie Tharp set his cane against the counter, steadied himself on the edge of his stool, and made his decision. Olvie Tharp did not stand up the way younger men stand up. He did it in stages. A hand on the counter edge, a shift of weight, the cane retrieved and planted, and then the slow, certain rise of a man who has learned that standing up is an act that costs something and therefore should mean something. 75 years old, VFW cap, green work pants, the kind of flannel shirt that gets washed so many times it stops having a color and starts having a history. He turned to face the room. Not the Grady's specifically, the room. Because what he was about to say was not for Fletcher and Sylvia. It was for the 12 other people sitting in Starling's diner on a Wednesday afternoon who had just watched a glass of wine get poured over the head of a man they knew and who needed to hear certain things said out loud. His voice had not lost anything to age. If anything, it had gained weight. The voice of a man who had been believed and disbelieved in equal measure over a long life and had arrived at a place where the distinction no longer changed what he said. Cord Malone paid for my surgery, he said. Both knees. The VA wasn't covering it. I was looking at 2 more years, barely able to walk, maybe worse. I never asked him directly. I mentioned it once to someone who mentioned it to someone else, the way things move in a small town. And 3 days later, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No name on the return address. But I knew. Everybody who knows Cord knew. He looked at Fletcher Grady. That is who you poured your wine on. Fletcher opened his mouth. Olvie sat back down with the same deliberateness with which he had risen, retrieved his coffee, and said nothing further. He had said what needed saying. Anything more would have been performance, and Olvie Tharp had no patience left for performance. The room was silent in a different way now. Not the held breath silence of shock. The weighted silence of a room that is listening, that has decided to listen, that understands something is happening that deserves attention. Nora Finch untied her apron, folded it once, and set it on the counter. She had worked 11 years at Starling's. She had served the Gradys twice before, and both times she had gone home afterward and sat at her kitchen table for a while before she could talk normally to her husband. She had not talked about why exactly, because some things are difficult to explain to people who were not in the room. She looked at Sylvia Grady, not at Cord. 3 years ago, Nora said, my mother's bakery was going under. 22 years on the same block, same oven, same recipes she brought from her own mother. The landlord raised the rent in January. Not to cover costs, to push her out so he could renovate and charge twice as much to someone new. We couldn't afford a lawyer. We couldn't afford the time a lawyer would have taken even if we could afford the fee. She paused, not for effect, because the memory still had weight and she was carrying it across the room. Cord heard about it. I don't know how. I didn't tell him. He walked into that landlord's office on a Tuesday morning, and whatever was said in that room, I was never told. And my mother never told me either because she didn't know. What I know is that the rent came back to what it was before. And it has stayed there. For 3 years it has stayed there. And my mother still has her bakery, and she still uses her grandmother's recipes. And Cord Malone has never once in 3 years mentioned it to either of us or asked for a single thing in return. She picked her apron back up, tied it, went back to the coffee station as if she had said nothing extraordinary because in her understanding of it she had not. She had simply said what was true. Beckett Webb spoke from the booth in the back. 26 years old. Compact, serious face, the kind of young man who has learned seriousness the hard way and wears it without apology. He had a grease mark on the back of his right hand that he hadn't noticed. I had a felony conviction at 19, he said. He did not lower his voice. Stupid decision, wrong crowd, wrong night, and I paid for it in the ways you pay for things like that. For 4 years after I got out, I sent applications to every shop within 40 miles. Got 11 callbacks, 11 interviews. Same result every time. The moment they ran the background check, the job was gone. He looked at his hands the way people look at things that used to mean something different than they mean now. Cord gave me a job when I had run out of places to ask. Didn't make me explain myself beyond what I'd already said in the first 5 minutes. Taught me engines the way someone teaches you something when they actually believe you're capable of learning it. Told me one time once, never again, didn't repeat it, that the only thing the past should do is teach you, not define you. He paused. I have my own shop now. 3 employees. One of them is a kid who had a record, and I hired him for the same reason Cord hired me. He looked at Fletcher Grady for the first time since he'd started speaking. That's the man you thought it was safe to pour wine on. Fletcher Grady's expression had been doing something complicated for the past several minutes. It had started as the expression of a man recalibrating a narrative that wasn't landing the way he'd written it. It had moved through something close to dismissal, something close to impatience, and had arrived somewhere that was harder to read. Not remorse, not yet, and perhaps not ever. Something more preliminary than remorse. The look of a man who has walked into a room and begun to understand for the first time that the room is larger than he thought, and that he does not know where all the walls are. Sylvia had gone quiet in a way that was different from her earlier performance of quiet. That had been the quiet of selection of assessment, the quiet of a hawk before it moves. This was something else. This was the quiet of a woman who has lost the thread of a script she didn't know she was reading from. Owen Sattler came around from behind the counter. He set both hands flat on the Grady's table and looked at them with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who has owned a diner for 31 years and has learned that most situations eventually resolve into something simple if you are willing to wait long enough to find out what it is. "I'm going to bring you both some water," he said, "and I'm going to ask you to sit with it quietly for a few minutes. Can you do that?" It was not really a question. He went back behind the counter. Cord Malone had not looked up through any of this. He sat with his coffee and his newspaper and the wine drying in his beard, and he was perfectly, completely still. And if you had not been watching carefully, you might have thought he was unaware of what was happening around him. But Nora had been watching carefully. She had been watching for 11 years, and she knew the difference between a man who was unaware and a man who was waiting. Cord's right hand was resting on the table beside the newspaper. Not gripping anything, not tense, but the fingers were slightly spread the way a man's fingers spread when he is paying attention to something at a frequency other people cannot hear. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out a small notebook. Not new. The cover was dark brown leather gone soft at the corners, the kind of softness that takes years of handling to develop. A rubber band held it closed. He set it on the table in front of him and left his hand on top of it without opening it. Nora looked at it. Owen looked at it from behind the counter. Olvie, who had seen it before, looked away because he already knew what it meant, and what it contained, and the knowing of it had been sitting in him like a stone for 7 months. The door opened. Sheriff Lyndon Price walked in. He was 61 years old, lean in the way of men who have spent decades on their feet, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent consideration. He had a history with Cord Malone that was long and not uncomplicated. They had stood on opposite sides of certain questions over certain years and had arrived through the particular process of two stubborn men paying sustained attention to each other at something that was not quite friendship and not quite alliance, and was possibly more durable than either. He crossed to the counter. Nora filled his cup without being asked. He took a slow sip. Then he looked at Owen, who tilted his head almost imperceptibly toward the Grady's booth. Price turned. "Fletcher Grady," he said, the same tone he might use to read an item off a grocery list. Not aggressive, not performative, simply accurate. Fletcher straightened in the way people straighten when addressed by law enforcement. The automatic response that exists even in people who believe they have nothing to fear from it, which is its own kind of information. "Sheriff," Fletcher said. "Good, I was about to—" "7 months," Price said. He sat down on the stool beside Olvie and did not look at Fletcher while he said it, which was more effective than looking at him would have been. 11 formal complaints across 3 counties. 2 civil matters settled quietly enough that the people who settled them felt like they'd lost, even though they'd been paid. 1 incident in Clearfield County with 3 witnesses on the record. He took another sip of coffee. "This diner has a camera." He nodded toward the mount above the register. "Has had one for 4 years. Everything that happened in here today has been recorded." Fletcher looked at the camera. He had been in this diner twice before and had not noticed the camera either time. This was important information about Fletcher Grady, not that he was unobservant, but that he had never in his life developed the habit of looking for cameras because cameras had never been a consideration for him. Cameras were for other people's problems. He looked at Price, then at the camera, then at Cord. "Whatever this is," Fletcher said, and his voice had found a new register, lower, more careful. The voice of a man accessing a familiar resource. "Whatever is being implied here, I have legal representation who—" "You're welcome to call them," Price said. "No one's stopping you." Silence. It was Cord who spoke next. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn to face the room. He spoke toward the window, toward the gray October light, as though what he was saying was addressed to the afternoon itself. "7 months ago," he said, "I started hearing about a couple working their way through this part of the state. Not rumors exactly. More like the particular kind of story that gets told quietly in corners by people who don't expect anyone to do anything about it. Elderly people, people with disabilities, working people, people who don't make news." He set his hand more firmly on the notebook. I have been in 4 public places over the past 7 months. Sat alone, looked like what I look like. A brief pause, which is apparently easy. Sylvia's jaw tightened. I watched. I wrote things down. I talked to people afterward who didn't know I was talking to them about this. He finally looked up not at the Grady's, but at the notebook under his hand. Today was the 5th time. He opened the notebook. The pages were dense with handwriting dates, locations, descriptions, names. 7 months of patience rendered in ink. The handwriting of a man who writes slowly and means every word. Fletcher looked at the notebook. Something moved through his face. Not fear yet, but the precursor to it, the moment when a man realizes that the ground he is standing on is not the ground he thought it was. "You were watching us," Sylvia said. It came out less like an accusation and more like a woman completing a calculation she had been working on for the past 10 minutes, arriving at an answer she had not expected. "I was confirming," Cord said, "what I was told." He closed the notebook. "And I was hoping every time I sat down in a new place that the people who told me were wrong." He looked at her then, just for a moment, and what was in his eyes was not satisfaction, not vindication. It was something closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow of a man who has been proven right about something he wished he'd been wrong about. "They weren't wrong," he said. The door opened again. Ruth Elmore came in first in her good blue coat, the one she reserved for occasions that required showing up in the best version of yourself. 71 years old, silver hair pinned back, walking with the careful dignity of a woman who has decided that difficulty is not a reason to present yourself as diminished. Behind her came the hardware store owner Bernard Chalk, still in his work apron. The pharmacist Greta Hollis, who had closed 15 minutes early and would explain why to anyone who asked without any embarrassment about the answer. And a young woman of 19, Jessie Kowalski, who had been the teenage cashier at the hardware store 3 years ago, and who was now working her way through her first year at the community college in Billings and had driven 40 minutes to be here because Nora Finch had sent her a text that said simply, "Today is the day. Come if you can." They came in without drama. They found seats in the booths around the room and settled in with the quiet purposefulness of people who have been told where to be and understand why. Each of them was a page in the notebook under Cord's hand. Each of them was a story that had been told quietly in corners by someone who did not expect anyone to do anything about it. Fletcher Grady looked at the room filling up around him and did a kind of accounting. The kind that happens when a man who has spent years believing himself to be untouchable begins to understand with gathering clarity that untouchable is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary one contingent on things he had not bothered to examine because he had never needed to. Sylvia Grady was very still. Cord was looking at the notebook again. His right hand moved along the edge of it slowly, not opening it, just touching it, the way a man touches something that has cost him something to accumulate. And then something happened in his face. It was small, easy to miss if you were not watching for it, and most people in the room were watching Fletcher and Sylvia and the gathering assembly of faces they recognized, and the sheriff at the counter with his coffee. But Nora was watching Cord because she had been watching Cord for 11 years, and she saw it. His eyes dropped to his left wrist. The sleeve of the vest had shifted slightly when he opened the notebook, and the tattoo was visible again. 4 letters, plain block, the ink gone slightly blue with age, but still legible, still clear, still exactly what it had always been. Wren. He looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through him that did not reach his face, except in the faintest possible way, the way deep water moves in a place where the surface appears still. 30 years of Wednesday afternoons in this booth. 30 years of envelopes with no return address. 30 years of walking into landlords' offices and sitting across from young men with records and showing up with a crew when a roof needed fixing. 30 years of doing for other people what he could not do for the one person it had mattered most to do it for. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he looked up at Fletcher Grady. And when he spoke this time, the room went very quiet because there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Not anger, not heat, but something older and more irreversible. "I had a brother," Cord said. He said it simply the way you say things that have been true for so long. They have become part of the structure of the world, rather than information you are delivering. His name was Wren. He was 19 years old. He died in 1974, 8 months before he was supposed to come home. I got the telegram in a garage in Butte, Montana at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was working on a transmission. The paper fell on the floor, and I left it there for an hour because I already knew what it said, and I was not ready to pick it up. No one moved. Every person I have helped in this town, Cord said, is someone Wren never got to meet. That is the only way I know to explain it. It is the only explanation I have ever had. He looked at Fletcher Grady the way a man looks at something that has forced him, against his preference, to say out loud the thing he has carried quietly for 50 years. And you sat down next to me today, Cord said, because you thought I was nobody. Fletcher Grady said nothing. For the first time in the years that people in Grover's Mill had known his name, Fletcher Grady had nothing to say. The resource he reached for was not there. The familiar current of confidence and contempt and the certainty that rooms bend to accommodate people like him, it was there, but it was not flowing. Something had interrupted it. Something about the room, about the faces, about the notebook, about the 7 words that had been spoken without heat an hour ago, about the name tattooed on an old man's wrist in letters gone blue with time. Owen Sattler came out from behind the counter. He looked at Cord. He looked at the room, at Ruth in her blue coat, at Beckett Webb, with the grease mark on his hand, at Olvie Tharp, and his cane and his VFW cap at Nora, standing at the coffee station at Lyndon Price, on his stool at Bernard and Greta, and young Jesse Kowalski, who had driven 40 minutes in a car with a broken heater to sit in this booth on this afternoon. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Cord, and what was on his face was the expression of a man who has been holding something in trust for 3 months and has arrived at the moment he was holding it for. Cord, he said quietly. Just the name. Nothing else needed. From somewhere outside, distant but growing unmistakable, the sound began. Low at first, the way thunder begins felt more than heard. A vibration in the floor in the base of the coffee mugs and the old red vinyl of the booth seats. The sound of engines. Not 1, not 5, not 10. Cord turned his head toward the window. His expression did not change, but his hand, the right one, the one that had been resting flat on the table beside the worn leather notebook, lifted slightly. Just slightly. The way a man's hand lifts when he recognizes something coming toward him from a long way off. Something he sent for 11 words 40 minutes ago. Something that had already been on its way. The sound grew the way certain things grow, not in a straight line, but in layers, each one arriving before you had fully processed the one before it, so that by the time you understood what you were hearing, it had already become something larger than understanding could keep pace with. First, it was vibration. The coffee in Cord's mug trembled at its surface, a faint circular ripple, the way water moves when something heavy is moving toward it from a distance. The overhead light fixture shifted almost imperceptibly. The spoons on the counter stirred. Then it was sound. Low and sustained, the particular register of large engines running at idle, not racing, not aggressive, but continuous and massed and unmistakable to anyone who had ever stood near it. Then it was both and growing. Lyndon Price set his coffee cup down and walked to the window without being asked. He stood there for a moment looking out at 4th Street, and then he came back to his stool and sat down and picked up his coffee and said nothing. But the expression on his face had changed in a way that was visible to anyone watching him, and several people were. Nora Finch moved to the window. She looked out and was still for a long time. The first of them appeared at the top of 4th Street, coming from the direction of the highway, 2 abreast in the unhurried way of men who are not going anywhere in a hurry because they have already arrived at the decision to come, and the destination is no longer the point. The low October sun caught the chrome and scattered it in all directions, brief and brilliant like light off moving water. Then more behind those. They filled the street the way a river fills a channel, not all at once, but with the patient, inevitable pressure of something that has been accumulating for a long time and has finally found its outlet. 2 abreast, moving slowly, the sound of their engines a single continuous thing, composed of dozens of individual things, the way a choir is a single sound made of many voices. They were from 3 states. Some had driven through the night, some had driven through the previous afternoon. Not one of them had been asked to explain himself or justify the distance. The message had been 11 words, and the 11 words had been enough because that was the nature of what had been built over 50 years, and particularly over the last 30. Not an organization exactly, not a hierarchy exactly, but a web of obligation and trust and shared understanding about what certain things mean when they are said by certain people. The street filled, 1 block, then 2. People came out of the businesses along 4th Street to stand on the sidewalk. The woman from the flower shop, the man from the insurance office who locked the door behind him with his coat still on his desk chair. Two teenagers from the high school who happened to be walking past and stopped and took out their phones and then put their phones away again because somehow it seemed wrong to reduce it to that. The people of Grover's Mill stood on their sidewalks and watched. Inside Starling's diner, Sylvia Grady had risen from her seat. She stood at the window and she looked out at the street, and for the first time in the telling of this story, and possibly for the first time in a long while, she had no script. The room she was in had exceeded the boundaries of any room she had ever been trained to navigate. The calculation she had spent her adult life performing: who matters, who doesn't, what can be taken, what will be given. The calculation simply stopped working because what was outside the window of Starling's diner on this Wednesday afternoon in October could not be entered into it. These were not people responding to a transaction. They were not people who had been hired or organized or incentivized. They were people who had received 11 words from a man they trusted and had gotten on their motorcycles in 3 states and driven however far they needed to drive because that was what the 11 words required. Sylvia had spent her life in rooms full of people responding to transactions. She had never stood at a window and watched this. Fletcher Grady had not moved from the booth. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, the eyes of a man processing something at a speed that is slightly slower than events are moving, which is one of the most disorienting experiences available to human beings. He had been, for the entirety of his adult life, the fastest processor in any room he entered. He had counted on that. It had never failed him. It was failing him now. Cord Malone stood up from his booth. He was unhurried about it, the way he was unhurried about everything. He tucked the worn notebook back into the inside pocket of his vest. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. He buttoned the single button at the collar of his vest, a gesture so small and habitual that it was clearly not performed for anyone's benefit, just a man making himself right before walking somewhere. He walked toward the Grady's booth. He did not look at Sylvia at the window. He looked at Fletcher, who looked up at him with the expression of a man who is not certain for the first time in memory what is about to happen to him. Cord stopped at the edge of their table. He stood there for a moment, not looming, not threatening, just present the way he was always present, with the quality of a man who takes up exactly as much space as he occupies and does not perform any part of it. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been all afternoon. Quiet. Flat in the way that genuine stillness is flat. "You poured wine on my head," he said, "because you looked at me and decided I was nobody. I want you to understand something before you leave this room." Fletcher met his eyes. To his credit, he did not look away. "Every person who stood up in here today," Cord said, "I did not ask a single one of them. Not today, not ever. I never asked for any of it back." He paused just briefly. "And every engine you hear out there right now, I sent 11 words and they drove through the night. I didn't ask them to do that either. I said where I was. That was enough." He let that sit for a moment. That, he said, is the difference between us. He held Fletcher's eyes for one more second, not to establish dominance, not to make a point, simply because he had said what was true, and he was giving it the weight of his attention before he moved on. Then he turned without hurry and walked toward the back of the diner, where Owen Sattler was holding open the door to the room that had been 3 months in the preparation. The room erupted. Not a cheer exactly, not the organized sound of an audience responding on cue. It was something more personal than that, more specific, the sound a group of people makes when they are genuinely, privately, deeply glad. The sound of relief mixed with affection, mixed with the particular joy that comes from celebrating something long overdue. Cord stood in the doorway for a long moment. The room was packed beyond what its dimensions had been designed for. Teachers, veterans, young parents with children on their hips, children who would not remember this day, but whose parents would tell them about it someday when they were old enough for the telling to mean something. Former kids from the mentorship program, now grown into men and women with their own lives and their own children, and the particular look of people who know specifically and personally how different things might have gone. A pastor, a nurse, a retired firefighter named Hector Dawes, who had driven 3 hours from Billings and had not told anyone he was coming because Hector Dawes was not the kind of man who announced himself. And there at the back, standing together the way they had been standing together for more than half a century, were 3 men Cord had served with. Old now, all of them. Slower than they had been. but they're specifically deliberately having driven or flown or been driven by someone younger from wherever they had been living the lives that came after. Cord looked at them. One of them nodded. Just once. Cord nodded back. It was enough. It had always been enough with them. He moved into the room and the crowd closed around him the way people close around someone they love. Not suffocating, not constraining, just present, just near the physical expression of a feeling that doesn't always find its way into words. Olvi Tharp made his way through the crowd to stand at Cord's right. He planted his cane, settled his weight, and did not say anything. He simply stood there the way a man stands beside someone when he understands that what the person needs is not words, but the proximity of someone who knows the whole story. The conversations that happened in that room over the next 3 hours were the kind that don't translate well to summary. They were specific. They were granular. A man showing Cord a photograph of a business that now employed 6 people because of a conversation Cord had with a lender 7 years ago. A woman who had been 15 when Cord had spoken 4 sentences to her father that changed the direction of the decision he was about to make, and she didn't find out until years later what those sentences had been, or who had spoken them, or why. A boy of 9 brought by his mother who did not yet understand the full context of why he was here, but who shook Cord's hand with the seriousness of a child who has been told this is important and has chosen to believe it. Cord stepped outside twice. The first time he stood alone at the end of the narrow hallway that led to the back door, and he put one hand against the wall and he breathed, and he did not do anything else for about 90 seconds. Then he went back inside. The second time, Olvi followed him. They stood together in the cold October air behind the diner, neither of them speaking, looking at the alley and the sky and the mountains going purple at the edges in the last of the afternoon light. After a while, Olvi said, "He would have liked this." Cord didn't answer immediately. He looked at the mountains. "He would have found it embarrassing," Cord said. "He always hated a fuss." "That's true," Olvi said. "He would have complained about it the whole time and then talked about it for a year." Cord made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one, the closest he had come all day. They stood there a little longer. The sound of the engines idling on 4th Street reached them even here, steady and low, a presence rather than a noise. Then Cord straightened up, buttoned that same collar button which had come undone again, and went back inside. In the front of the diner, the evening had brought a different quality of quiet to the Grady's booth. Lyndon Price had remained at the counter, unhurried, drinking what was by now his 3rd cup of coffee available, for whatever the next steps required, but in no particular rush about it. He had learned over 31 years in law enforcement that the most important moments rarely require urgency. Urgency is for emergencies. What this was not an emergency. What this was an accounting, and accountings take their proper time. Fletcher Grady had made a phone call. His attorney presumably reached through the same reflex that makes men like Fletcher reach for their lawyers, the way other men reach for a steadying hand. Not because they believe the lawyer will change anything, but because the act of calling is itself a form of control, a way of reasserting agency in a room where agency has been substantially reduced. The call had lasted 4 minutes. Fletcher had said very little during it and had listened to the voice on the other end with an expression that suggested the voice on the other end was also not saying what he had hoped to hear. He put the phone down on the table and sat with it. Sylvia had returned to the booth from the window. She sat across from Fletcher and she was looking at him, and what passed between them in that looking was private and would remain so. The specific reckoning of 2 people who have been in something together and are beginning to understand simultaneously that the thing they have been in has been quietly and thoroughly dismantled while they were in it. Outside, the consequences began their work. Not loudly, not with the drama that Fletcher and Sylvia might have expected from men with engines and leather and numbers. Quietly, methodically. In the way that things are dismantled when the people doing the dismantling have been around long enough to understand that lasting damage is done not through force, but through exposure. The footage from Owen's camera had reached 3 people within the hour. Those 3 people had sent it to others. By morning, it would have traveled a distance that could not be measured in miles. Fletcher Grady's face pouring wine over an old man's head in a diner in Montana. His name attached to 11 formal complaints and 2 quiet civil settlements. The notebook, the camera, the room full of people standing up one after another with their specific, credible, dated accounts. By Thursday morning, the development partners Fletcher had spent 14 months cultivating in Westboro County would begin making calls that he would not be able to answer in the way he had answered calls before. By Friday, his name would be removed from 2 charitable boards quietly without announcement, in the way that organizations perform amputations when they need to, not with ceremony, but with the swift, clean motion of people who have decided that association is no longer worth the cost. By the following week, Lyndon Price would have 3 new witnesses sitting across from him in his office, people who had been waiting separately and without knowledge of each other for a moment that felt like the right moment. The moment had arrived. They came in on their own, without subpoena, without pressure. Simply people who had been watching from a distance and had decided that distance was no longer the right position. The deal Fletcher had been building in Grover's Mill, the one that had required goodwill he had never actually earned and had simply assumed would be available, because it had always been available to him before that deal unraveled in 48 hours. Not dramatically. No confrontations, no public statements, no press. Just phone calls, unreturned emails answered briefly, and finally a gradual withdrawal of the particular warmth that business requires and that cannot be manufactured when it has been genuinely withdrawn. Fletcher Grady was not arrested that Wednesday. He was not confronted with a reckoning that had the clean, satisfying shape of a scene in a film. What happened to him was slower and more thorough than that, and more appropriate, the methodical collapse of a man's ability to operate in the world he had built for himself, executed not through violence or spectacle, but through the accumulated weight of what he had actually done, presented by the people he had actually done it to, in a room with a camera and a sheriff at the counter. 3 weeks after that Wednesday afternoon, a small envelope arrived in Ruth Elmore's mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single page of personal stationery, handwritten in a script that was careful and controlled, and took more effort than ordinary handwriting, which is its own kind of information. Ruth stood at her kitchen table and read it. She read it twice. Then she stood at this table for a long time without doing anything else. The light through the kitchen window was the particular light of a November afternoon in Montana, flat and gray, and without warmth, the light of a season that makes no promises. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, opened the kitchen drawer where she kept things she was not yet ready to decide about, and put it there. She did not throw it away. She did not pick up the phone. She left it where it was in the drawer, available for a decision she would make when she understood better what the right decision was. The question the letter raised, whether sorrow that arrives late is worth the same as sorrow that arrives on time, whether a person can genuinely reckon with what they have done to another person or only perform the appearance of it, whether Sylvia Grady had written that letter because she understood something or only because she needed something, that question did not have a clean answer. Ruth understood that it might not have one. She had lived 71 years, and she had learned that the most important questions rarely resolve into clean answers. They resolve into the decisions you make while carrying them. She closed the drawer. She put on her coat. She walked to the end of her driveway and checked the rest of the mail, and then she went back inside and started dinner, and the letter stayed in the drawer where she had put it, and the question stayed where it was, and neither of them was going anywhere. On 4th Street, the last of the engines turned over just after 8 o'clock. Cord came out of Starling's diner into the cold night air. His vest was still wine-stained at the collar. He had not changed it and had not wanted to. It was his, and it had been through worse, and what it wore, it had earned. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was quiet now, most of the crowd gone, the businesses dark. A few of his brothers remained finishing coffee from thermoses. The comfortable silence of men who have known each other long enough that silence is not absence, but presence. They looked up when he came out. Nobody said anything. They had said what needed saying inside and out here. The night required something different. He walked to his bike. It was parked exactly where he had left it that afternoon, before any of this, when he had come to Starling's, because Olvie had told him there was a VFW meeting at 5, and he was early because he was always early, and he had wanted coffee and a quiet hour with the newspaper. Before Fletcher Grady had made his decision, before 11 words had traveled across 3 states, before a room full of people had stood up one after another in a diner on 4th Street in October and said what was true, he ran his hand along the seat. A habit. The way a man touches something he has had a long time and intends to have longer. He put on his helmet, started the engine. The sound of it was low and immediate and exactly what it had always been, and around him, one by one, without signal or ceremony, the others started theirs. The sound built the way it had built that afternoon in layers, each one arriving before the last was complete, until it was a single thing composed of many things. The people who were still out on 4th Street turned to watch. Cord pulled away from the curb slowly. The others fell in behind him, two abreast the way they had arrived. He moved down 4th Street toward the highway, and the town moved past on either side of him, the hardware store and the flower shop, and the insurance office, and Starling's diner with its missing apostrophe, and its camera above the register, and its red vinyl booths patched with electrical tape. At the edge of town, he checked his mirror. The line of riders stretched behind him the full length of the street. And beyond them, the town, the lights of it, small and specific against the dark of the valley, the mountains invisible now in the night sky, but present as they always were, whether you could see them or not. He looked at his left wrist where it rested on the handlebar. The tattoo was there as it had always been. 4 letters, block print, worn slightly soft at the edges by 50 years of living in the world. A name that had been a boy once, 19 years old, 8 months from coming home. Ren. Cord held the image of it for a moment, the name on his wrist and the town in the mirror, and the sound of the engines behind him like a living thing, like something that had a weight and a pulse and a direction. Then he faced forward, and he rode.